Americans feel poorer than ever, even as the economy improves. Here's the paradox. Interest rates are coming down. Inflation has mostly cooled off. The real economy is still doing decently well. And yet consumer confidence is worse than it was during the Great Recession, and even worse than the inflation crisis of the late 1970s. That's not a talking point. That's what the data says. And if you felt a low-grade anxiety every time you check prices, scroll your phone, or think about your future, this story is about you. Because something strange is happening. Traditional explanations aren't lining up anymore. Normally, when inflation falls and jobs hold up, people feel better. This time, they don't. And that gap between reality and perception is widening fast. The article lays out several possible explanations people are throwing around, from politics to tariffs to fears about AI replacing jobs. But then it introduces a different idea, one that doesn't show up in economic charts but shows up every time you open TikTok or Instagram. Here's the part nobody is saying out loud. What if Americans aren't reacting to the economy at all? What if they're reacting to a constant stream of other people's lives? The article frames this as a hypothesis, not a settled fact. But it's a hypothesis worth taking seriously because it explains something the usual economic models don't. Consumer sentiment has broken away from its traditional drivers, and when that happens, it means something outside the standard economic toolkit is at work. The core idea is simple. Social media is warping how people define the good life. In the past, Americans mostly compared themselves to people they actually knew, co-workers, neighbors, family, friends, the classic keeping up with the Joneses. That kind of comparison could sting, but it was bounded. The Joneses usually lived in the same neighborhood, worked similar jobs, and faced similar constraints. But now, the article argues, those reference points have been replaced by algorithmic feeds filled with strangers. And not just any strangers, influencers. People whose entire online presence revolves around displaying a lifestyle, travel, clothes, homes, leisure, and while some of these lifestyles are modest, many are not. They skew rich, leisurely, visually perfect. The article gives specific examples. Influencers whose feeds are dominated by exotic vacations, scenic locations, and expensive clothing, not presented as fantasy, presented as everyday life. And crucially, these aren't always billionaires or celebrities. They often look like upper middle class or lightly rich people. The kind of life that feels just barely within reach. That's what makes it dangerous, because when something looks plausible, your brain asks a quiet question. Why don't I live like that? The article makes a strong claim here, and then backs it up with evidence. Social media doesn't just correlate with unhappiness. In controlled studies, it actively causes it. It cites a 2016 review by Apple and others looking at research on Facebook use. One line stands out. Cross-sectional evidence demonstrates a positive correlation between the amount of Facebook use and the frequency of social comparisons on Facebook. That's not abstract. It means the more people scroll, the more they compare themselves to others. And the comparison isn't neutral. The same review notes an increased impression of being inferior and links that directly to negative affective outcomes. Then it gets more specific. In one experiment mentioned in the article, women were instructed to spend just 10 minutes looking at their Facebook page. Not hours, 10 minutes. Their mood dropped compared to women who looked at control websites. And among participants who already had a tendency to compare themselves to others, satisfaction with their own appearance fell even further. That matters because it shows causality, not just coincidence. Social media wasn't just reflecting insecurity, it was producing it. But here's the detail that changes everything. During the 2010s, when these effects were already measurable, consumer confidence was still high. People might have felt worse about their bodies or their relationships, but they didn't feel economically defeated. They weren't seething about their material lives, so something else had to change. Notice what the article quietly points out next. Social media itself evolved. People stopped mostly looking at their friends. Instead, they started watching algorithmic feeds filled with strangers. And once that happened, the object of comparison shifted from personal milestones to lifestyles. This is where the comparison stops being emotional and starts becoming economic. And once money enters the comparison loop, the dissatisfaction doesn't stay temporary anymore. It sticks, because now you're not just comparing vacations or weddings, you're comparing entire lives. This is where the situation escalates, because the article argues that today's comparison environment is historically unusual. There have always been rich people. In 1922, in 1960, in 1990. But most Americans rarely saw them. You might read about them in a magazine or see them on a TV show, but they didn't float through your daily life. They weren't embedded in your idle moments, your boredom, your downtime. Now they are. The article makes this concrete. Thanks to algorithmic feeds, people are routinely exposed to lifestyles that are economically out of reach for the average American. Big houses, European vacations, fancy dinner parties, designer clothes, not as spectacle, but as routine, as normal. And these aren't always ultra-billionaires. They often look like people in the top 5% or 1%, rich, but not cartoonishly rich. Their lives look plausible. That's the trap, because when something looks plausible, your brain asks a quiet question. Why don't I live like that? In the past, social comparison happened within relatively homogeneous groups. Housing markets, job markets, and neighborhoods naturally sorted people into similar income brackets. You compared yourself to people whose lives were constrained by roughly the same limits. That boundary has now collapsed. What used to be rare exposure is now constant. What used to be exceptional is now normalized. And what used to feel aspirational now feels like a minimum standard. This normalization is the dangerous part, because once a lifestyle feels normal, failing to achieve it doesn't feel like bad luck. It feels like personal failure. And once that feeling spreads, it doesn't matter if inflation is falling or jobs are holding up. The emotional baseline has already shifted. Here's the contradiction that permanently changes how you see this. In the past, when people encountered wealth up close, they usually understood where it came from. If you knew a rich guy in 1995 who owned a car dealership, you knew how he made his money. You could tell yourself a story: hard work, risk, skill, maybe some luck, but the path made sense, and crucially, it felt replicable, at least in theory. That explanation mattered. It acted like a psychological pressure valve. But now look at the influencers filling modern feeds. It's often not obvious what these people do for work or how they can afford what they're showing. Some run businesses, some have jobs you never see, some inherited wealth, and some make money simply by displaying their lifestyle online. And most viewers don't sit there consciously analyzing any of that. The wealth just appears, floating, contextless, delocalized. A big house, a perfect trip, a leisurely day, presented without explanation, without effort, without trade-offs. Notice what's missing. There's no visible grind, no failure, no constraint, no before, just the result. The article argues that this makes social comparison more corrosive than before, because when you can't explain the difference between your life and someone else's, you stop attributing it to circumstance. You internalize it. It stops being they did something different. It becomes something is wrong with me. This is where words like money dysmorphia and financial dysmorphia enter the conversation. A vague but persistent sense of inadequacy created by constant exposure to free-floating images of wealth. Then comes the data point that lands hard. A survey by the financial services company Empower found that Gen Z reported needing $588,000 a year to consider themselves financially successful. That number sits in the top 1% of incomes, 13 times the median personal income, more than 5 times the median family income. If that belief is real, not just a wording quirk, then the definition of success has drifted into mathematically unreachable territory for most people. And once success itself feels unattainable, dissatisfaction becomes the default. The article then stacks the implications. It's physically impossible to give every American an income anywhere near $588,000 in the near future. Redistribution can't do it. Growth can't do it either. Even rising incomes can't outrun a reference point that keeps drifting upward faster. So we end up with a pressure cooker. Redistribution hits political limits, growth hits psychological ceilings, and the lifestyle standard being broadcast daily is structurally unreachable. What happens if this continues? The article suggests that no combination of redistribution and growth will ever deliver the lifestyles being normalized on TikTok and Instagram for most people. Not anytime soon. That realization alone is destabilizing. Now bring it back to real life. You're doing okay by traditional standards. You have a job, you pay your bills, inflation is down, rates are easing. On paper, you should feel stable, but then you open your phone and stability feels like stagnation. You watch someone your age walking through a massive house, filming a morning routine, boarding a plane to Europe just for the weekend, over and over, not framed as exceptional, just life. You're not comparing yourself to billionaires. You're comparing yourself to people who feel adjacent, close enough to matter. And that quiet question returns, why not me? When reference points shift like this, progress stops registering. A raise doesn't feel like a win. A modest home doesn't feel like success. Skipping a vacation feels like failure. Dissatisfaction becomes ambient. This helps explain why economic pessimism feels so personal right now. It's not about GDP, it's about identity. Then the article zooms out to the system behind it all. Social media platforms are optimized for engagement, not realism. Content that shows comfort, beauty, and leisure spreads best. So the algorithm amplifies rare lifestyles, turning them into a distorted sample of reality. Humans learn what's normal by observing others. But now others means a global feed filtered for maximum attention, not representativeness. Social comparison isn't new. What's new is its scale, abstraction, and persistence. Influencers aren't neighbors. They're curated outputs of a machine. And constant low-grade dissatisfaction is extremely watchable. The article doesn't claim this is proven. It calls it an important hypothesis. Then it looks forward. One path is adaptation. Over time, people may recalibrate and recognize influencer lifestyles as rare. Another path is mitigation. More public goods, better shared spaces, cultural norms that discourage conspicuous display. None of this is guaranteed. And that brings us to the final insight. The problem isn't that Americans are poorer. It's that the mental image of doing well has drifted beyond what most people can reach. Until that image changes, dissatisfaction will keep outrunning the data. The deeper loop is simple. The more people feel behind, the more they scroll. The more they scroll, the further ahead the reference point moves. And that cycle is already shaping what people feel, expect, and demand next. The economy may improve. The question is whether our sense of reality will